I've been doing scoring for quite some time now, and I realize that the query reports, the data mining reports are useful, but that you have to put them together into some combined analysis because if you run, let's say, a vendor to employee test, that's useful. However, that one report may not tell the whole picture. However, let's take in this particular case, if I'm looking for vendors that might have fraud or might have a high incidence of error, I might want to run a variety of reports and put them all together. Again, not one report is going to find the answer. We need to find the trends among all of those reports. So we might want to look for duplicate payments that are showing up on various reports. I'm paid on different checks in this case, or ACH transactions. We might want to take a look at debit amounts that are being posted in the vendor accounts, or there's a high proportion of round dollar payments or invoices that are above average or 10 times, let's say exactly 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, then another invoice to that vendor. That's something weird, and it might just be a decimal issue. But again, one of these reports, it may not find something. If a vendor shows up on every one of these reports, that's starting to be a trend that you might want to look into. And I again started out with this simple vendor fraud scoring, but you can expand this to 20, 30, 40 reports very quickly, and we're going to talk about how to do that and combine them. However, again, it starts with this notion that one report is not going to get it. We're going to have to kind of go to multiple reports. When you look at why we're doing this, you kind of have to look at the problem of sampling and the fact that reviewers or auditors only have a limited amount of time to do their testing. So, modern tests that are out there, such as the ones we just listed, may identify thousands of transactions on each report, where what we found, and you could even just say as a bellwether, if even just 1 in 5 transactions of an entire database show up on a red flag report, if you have 1 million transactions, you're going to have 200,000 showing up on a red flag report. But when you really look at where there's real problems, it might be 0.01, 0.02%. What we found in taking a look for recoveries, let's say for duplicate payments, a lot of people will say it's 0.1%, 0.01%, and again, very, very low transaction rate. If you then take the 1 million transactions and multiply it by that, you're looking at only tens of thousands as opposed to 200,000 transactions. But as an auditor, you just don't have the time to look at all of this stuff and look at it across all of these reports. And, just doing some simple math here, you can figure out that you pretty much are throwing a random dart at 800 balloons, hoping to hit the right balloon out of all of them. And in a lot of cases, you don't even know which one is the right one. You're just kind of throwing it out there and just hoping to hit one. And again, that's almost an impossible feat. What transactional scoring does, and instead of scoring by vendor, let's say we're going to take each transaction and say that each transaction now is the sample unit that we're looking at. So if that sample unit is what we're working on, we're then going to figure out how many reports does it show up on. And our goal here is to say, let's pick a 50 unit sample, because there's only so much time in a day to do auditing. So let's just pick 50. But if we're going to pick those 50, let's kill more birds with one stone. That 50 might have 38 duplicate payments, 22 round invoices, 18 in-sequence invoices, and now I'm really hitting the ones that on a combined level are very strange and mathematically the most severe to be taking a look at. We're going to talk more about this as well, but you want to select items that are rare in multiple ways. You're not just selecting any weekend invoice now that's showing up on a report, and again, we're combining weekend invoices with duplicate payments, with round, and etc., and that's going to help. But now even to slice it even further, we want to take a look for those unusual weekend invoices, maybe ones that are large in relation to the others. So a large weekend invoice might be only 2% of the total. There might be a lot of little invoices in there, and who cares in a way, I guess, to some of that. But just taking a look at some of the large ones and now filtering my scoring down so that for each report, I'm now looking for each unusual circumstance. If I do that, I'm going to be raising my odds of finding that error or fraud since the invoice is large and also it's showing up on this unusual report. Another way to look for oddities, and again, this went to taking a look at those amounts that show up over and over again, let's say, is to do a number ranking. So if we're in, say, the weekend journal entry report, you might want to summarize that by each amount and rank the numbers in order of occurrence. You might want to do it for the entire population and just use that as your bellwether and say, let's create another report, again, part of the scoring, so, report 5 of the scoring, that says any number that shows up a lot we may want to consider to be weird, and any number that shows up only once would be also in a weird way as well. So you can almost create this score that is, again, based not only on is it on the report, but also from a numerical standpoint, is it very, very strange? And just imagine if you had all your amounts kind of listed high to low, and first you summarize on the amount and then list them all from high to low. Would be a way for you to kind of rank all of those numbers and then see the ones that are, again, showing up most and showing up least in the data, which can be related back and included as part of that scoring. In Excel, an easy way to do that, let's take a look at the sample data we provided for you. You can just select the data table that you're working with, click on the Insert button, and insert a pivot table. And that usually will cover all of the data. You might want to just check that, but usually does the trick. And you can click on the total invoice amount as a sum, but I'm actually going to change this in my value field settings, change that to count. Then I'm going to drag this into the row as well. So now I have it by row, and now we're getting there. We're almost there. Now that I have this summarized by amount, we know how many items are showing up by amount, and it's sorted from high to low based on the value itself. If I want to change the sort of that, I can click on Pivot Table Tools and just select anywhere in the data and say Sort. And in this case, what I want to do is I want to change this and say Descending based on the count of that invoice amount. And what that immediately does is it identifies those amounts that are showing up the most at the top and going, well, in this case we have a lot of ones, which tends to happen from 385, row 385 all the way down to row 5798. Those are the unique amounts. So, this is a way that you can filter. You might want to filter further and say, we want only invoice amounts that are over a certain value. So you can do a value filter as well and say top 10, or you can change that however you'd like. But again, you could select down below here, you could unselect the all and kind of drag down and say, okay, everything over $5,000 is what I want to have. And then that would be a way to select those as well. And then that would bring up everything over $5,000 that is either unique or showing up in a recurring basis. And you might want to take a look at items that are showing up, let's say, more than 10 times, which would be these numbers right here. So this is a way to quickly take a look at amounts that are showing up in a weird way and adding that into the score. So it's not just the report that we're looking at that we're all used to. We're also starting to look at the values of those amounts as well. This goes along the lines of digital analysis. And digital analysis is number ranking is one way of looking at it. Digital analysis would look at the first couple of digits of each number. So the $5 would show up as, in this case, well, we probably wouldn't have the $5 because that's 0 to 5. However, one way you can fool the system is you can multiply everything by 100 and bring everything that's, say, in $5 up to, in this case, 500, and then you would take those first two digits, which is 50. You may or may not want to do that. That's up to you on how you want to play with your digital analysis, but I wanted to show you how you could do that very quickly. However, by looking at your digital analysis or your number ranking, I like to look at it over time periods. So, maybe you have your first quarter, your second quarter, third, fourth, and then Benford's Law, which is a statistical pattern that a lot of people know about. And it is a law of numbers of what should happen in the data itself. All of this can be part of your scoring. I mean, you can get a little crazed about this and go too far, but I think just to do some of the simple things like summarizing by amount, summarizing by the first two digits, and finding those digit patterns that are against the norm, and the norm being Benford's Law, or your own data. So the norm could just be what has been our average digital analysis for the last 5 years, and what numbers are kind of kicking out from that digital analysis in the current period that we're reviewing. So that is a way to take a look at, in this case it was a quarterly law, but you could do this over any time period that you'd like. So going back to the simple pivot table that we had, let's show you how to adjust that for what we're talking about. We could just add a column into our data right next to the invoice amount, and in this case we'll call it first two digits, and we're just going to kind of keep this at a simple level right now and say equal this item here, but we're going to put the left function in there. So we're going to say left B2 for how many character numbers, again listed right here, we're going to say 2. And that gives us a score or a value of 41. By just copying that by right-clicking and selecting copy, you can find this little button right here. It's when you go to an X, you can double-click on that button, and generally speaking, you can either copy the cells all the way down, which would copy that formula all the way down, and as long as there's a number to the left, that will copy all the way down and provide those first two-digit numbers for your pivot tabling. Just going back to the pivot itself and selecting this, what we can do is select Pivot Table Tools and click the refresh button. Because we inserted a column into the actual data table, Excel is pretty smart and figured out that it added that first two digits. So let's kind of bring the first two digits down into that category here so we can show that. And I'm going to deselect, or actually in this case, I'm just going to drag this total amount field and drag it back into my list box above of the fields. So now I just have a count of the digits and the first two digits over here. So this provides you with that analysis, which again, you could add Benford's Law to this if you'd like. You could look up what Benford's Law is for the first two digits, or you could utilize this as a bit of a pattern that you can use for, let's say, aligning to next year's data or this quarter's data. And if you want to solidify this data set, you can go back up to the data set, just select any cell within the pivot table, type Control, Shift, and the number 8 key. And that will highlight all of the data in the pivot table. You can then right-click and copy that. And I suggest creating a new sheet for this. So I would say, you would right-click on your sheet row there and then say Worksheet, and just do a paste by right-clicking and saying Paste. And that will, and we can actually, we have an idea here of how we want to do that. Probably the best way to do it is in your paste special. You really just want to put your values. And by putting your values, it does not bring over the pivot table. You've now solidified your values. So again, best to go up to your paste values to do that. So now I have solidified values. We could say, first two digits last year, as an example. And now this could be used as a benchmark when you're relating your data to other periods of time. We've talked about how we can run reports that are weird, take a look at numbers that are weird. We can take a look even at amounts that are just large in the data set, which we're kind of putting all together here. I think what we're trying to get to is just what's weird in the data, what rules that are weird in the data, and you might want to consider a software that does that. WizRule is a particular software where it will actually identify all of these rules within the data. So this is just a very simple example. If in this particular field, if the old field had between $99 and $100, then the river field is 0. And this happens in 49 records, 96% chance of happening, happens all the time. However, there's two deviations here, 143 and 210, which actually, I believe this is 143 deviation, you can see that record. That is actually where river equals 1. Now, WizRule is very simple to run. You load your data in, it accepts Access and Excel and all this, and all you have to do is select this one button, Issue Reports. It's fantastic. And then it provides all these rules. The problem, though, is that there are so many rules to take a look at. And something like this, from an audit standpoint, I think everyone would agree has almost no value. You sit there and look at it and say, well, so what? Yet as we go back to this previous slide, if we can take all of those deviations, and there's not that many across the entire data set, and put that into our scoring engine, it's something where you get almost like an automated statistician to join the audit team, and all you had to do is hit that one button, mind you, to get all of those rules between the fields. It's going to take every data field and match it to every other data field and look for these rules automatically. You don't have to think about it or do anything. It's going to identify the deviations, which can be exported very easily from WizRule. And I mean, again, a sample one that might be really useful, by the way, is where you may have a vendor that has checks in sequence, such as 1 to 100,000. Every check that they have shows up in there 99% of the time, and it's for one vendor. However, they have 1% of their invoices in the check series 500,000 and up. To find that type of deviation, similar to the river example before, is so difficult to find. However, to use the tool, hit the button, let it do the work, only take the kind of the cream off of the top there, the deviations, and add that to the scoring list, you now really can identify what's weird in the data. And these are things that you would never look for, and let's say a fraudster would also never expect you to be looking for as well. And that's the key thing. Everyone expects the vendor to employee test. No one expects to make sure that the river field is included with a 0 versus a 1, and then hence that might kick out on a deviation report that would be useful for your analysis.